Hi, this is Kim Wehle, Simple Politics. My guest today is Professor Paul Miller, who's professor of the practice at Georgetown School of Foreign Service. He was director for Afghanistan for the NSC, both for Presidents Bush and Obama, former CIA intelligence officer, as well as a military intelligence officer for the U.S. Army. He is here to talk to us about what's happening under the Biden administration in Afghanistan, these terrible videos we're seeing on television, and soup to nuts bring us up to speed. Thank you, Professor Miller, for coming on today.
Thanks for having me on the show.
So what I'd like to start with is if you could take us back 20 years to why we Americans got into the conflict in Afghanistan to begin with.
Yeah, so the United States went to war in Afghanistan, of course, because of the terrorist attacks of 2001, carried out by a group called Al-Qaeda that was headquartered in Afghanistan and also shielded by the Taliban government. The Taliban and Al-Qaeda are very closely interweaved, and they always have been, and they certainly were in 2001. The United States, President Bush, demanded to the Taliban that they hand over bin Laden and allow the international community to come in and dismantle the terrorist training camps. The Taliban refused, and President Bush sensibly said, we're going to declare war on Al-Qaeda and on anybody that shields them. And so that meant the Taliban.
So what is the Taliban, and how, just in terms of defining a terrorist organization or a governmental organization, what is the Taliban for people that hear it on TV but can't provide a definition? And
Yeah.
how does that compare to what we know as Al-Qaeda, which is less in the news, and then of course ISIS?
Yeah. So to answer what is the Taliban, you really have to go back quite a long ways. The very word talib simply means student. These were students in madrasas in Afghanistan and Pakistan who were students of a sheikh named Mullah Omar. And so they called themselves the Taliban, that is to say, the students of this particular cleric. We have to kind of go back to the Soviet-Afghan War of the 1980s. The Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in 1979, fought for 10 years, lost that war. The United States, Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan gave a lot of money and weapons to the Afghan resistance, called themselves the Mujahideen. Some people believe and claim that the Taliban was one of those groups, or rather that the Mujahideen simply morphed and turned into Taliban. That's not quite true. One or two of the factions we funded in the 80s did eventually become the Taliban, but most of them didn't. Four of the factions actually became the Northern Alliance, which became our allies. But what you need to understand is that in the 1990s, Afghanistan was in the middle of a civil war amongst many factions and warlords who had previously been allies against the Soviet Union. The Taliban emerged as a movement. These students of the cleric, Mullah Omar, emerged as a movement in Kandahar to put an end to the civil war and the warlordism and the factional infighting. And they were able to take half the country without fighting, the Pashtun half, the south and the east of the country. And they rolled in, made a promise to restore law and order, and most Afghans welcomed it. They loved it. It's only when the Taliban went outside of the Pashtun areas that it really became a war, fighting against the Tajiks, the Hazara, the Uzbeks, the other ethnic minorities in Afghanistan.
So you mentioned a lot of these minorities, these different groups. What was the patchwork of authority prior to the Taliban taking over Pashtun, or delivering, at least from the people's perspective, some kind of order? What did it look like in terms of a governmental system?
Well, from 1992 to 1996, there was effectively no government. It was civil war. There was a internationally recognized group that didn't really govern much of anything. The answer to your question, Afghanistan had been a monarchy for a couple of hundred years before 1973. Then it was briefly a republic. Then the Soviet Union invaded, tried to make it a communist dictatorship. That failed. Then it was just a period of civil war until 1996 when the Taliban took over. And the Taliban then became the government of Afghanistan for 5 years. And their government is best described as a kind of a theocratic, totalitarian, failed state. It's the weirdest mix you'll find of a government that was as repressive and totalitarian as North Korea, and also as incompetent as like Somalia or the Democratic Republic of the Congo. That's why the Taliban were infamous back then, both for their tyranny, forcing women into burqas, shutting down girls' schools, banning cassette players, and chopping people's hands off and their heads off, and also for their just ineptitude. Afghanistan was essentially the worst government, the worst place to live on the planet, the poorest in the world, with the highest rates of infant mortality, the highest rates of disease, the lowest rates of immunization, the lowest rates of literacy. Just by every metric of human development, Afghanistan was the worst. And the Taliban didn't care. They didn't even try to govern to make these things better. They were only concerned with banning audio cassettes and repressing women and chopping people's heads off. That was what they were for. One of the most famous incidents was about 1998, when the Taliban decided that any art that was not Islamic was forbidden, and so they went to a province called Bamiyan in Afghanistan, where were these statues of the Buddha that dated back a couple thousand years, and these statues are not 5 feet tall. They're like 100 foot or 200 feet engravings on a cliffside. They were just remarkable achievements and wonders of the world. The Taliban blew them up for no other reason than that they deemed it to be un-Islamic and therefore impure. That's a good anecdote that captures the character of what the Taliban were in the 90s.
So that's really a stunning thing to hear, frankly, because you ask yourself, what is their animating objective then? If it is it religion, is it power, is it both, and again, how does a Taliban compare to ISIS? Because we've seen ISIS decapitate people.
Yeah.
American reporter famously on live stream, or at least on a video that then was circulated.
Yeah. So if you ask them, they would say that they're motivated by Islam. Okay. But we know that 99.9% of Muslims in the world, 2 billion Muslims, and most of them don't do this stuff, right? So if I want to be very accurate, I would characterize their ideology/theology as Salafist Takfiri jihadism. That's a lot of isms and a lot of words that maybe your listeners will be unfamiliar with. It's a very small, tiny school of thought within Islam that took root about 100 years ago in reaction to the British Empire, and then really grew in the 1970s on forward. Sometimes people call it political Islam. I think that's a bit of a misnomer. I prefer to call it jihadism, because what they do is they say that jihad, holy war, is the sixth pillar of Islam, right? Islam has 5 pillars traditionally, but these guys are essentially heretics within Islam because they claim that jihad is the 6th pillar, and they have a few other theological oddities that are very different from mainstream Islam. They think that every Muslim has a duty to wage jihad, and they think that Islam is under attack right now by America and the other sort of imperial powers of the world, what they say. Therefore, they have a right and a duty to defend all Islam from the aggressions, they say, the aggressions of the United States and the world order we represent. To them, they say the attacks of 9/11 were defensive because they believe that we're attacking them right now.
And that's also the ideology of Al-Qaeda and ISIS, or we hear similarly jihad, etc.
Yeah.
And
Yes.
obviously Al-Qaeda was behind the 9/11 attacks.
All of these groups are fellow travelers. They have a very similar way of thinking about the world. Their ideology and their theology is very similar. There'll be some differences here and there. The Taliban was always focused on Afghanistan. They were more of a local group. Al-Qaeda, its uniqueness was in thinking globally. They wanted to take the jihad and attack the far enemy, the United States, rather than just the near enemy of the local governments in the Arab world and in South Asia. And that's the distinction between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. But through the years, the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, they intermarried. They exchanged promises of support and protection. The two groups are not as easy to disentangle as you might think. They really have, in some senses, merged. And Al-Qaeda is, in fact, present today in Afghanistan. And with the Taliban takeover this last weekend, Al-Qaeda's presence will only grow.
And so bin Laden was the head of Al-Qaeda back then. At least that's my rough understanding. America goes in under the Bush administration. It sounds like, and I think most would agree, even watching what the little that people know, that the Taliban is a bad regime, but there are a lot of bad regimes across the globe. And there are a lot of terrorists across the globe. So what justified Afghanistan 20 years ago that doesn't bring us into other places, North Korea, Syria, Uyghurs in China, places where there's mass atrocities and dictatorships and, religious ideology that ends up, slaughtering and torturing people. Well, why Afghanistan? I think that's what Americans don't really understand.
So again, you're correct. Osama bin Laden was the founder and the head of Al Qaeda, and Al Qaeda's main operations were based out of Afghanistan at the time. Al Qaeda attacked the United States. We had a right to respond and to defend ourselves and prevent future attacks. The Taliban refused to cooperate with us, and they kept their alliance with Al Qaeda, thus becoming a rightful target in our war against Al Qaeda. Uh, to expand on that a little bit, um, uh, our goal was not simply bloodlust or revenge. It wasn't simply let's go kill a bunch of Al Qaeda guys and go home. Our goal was to deny safe haven for terrorists in Afghanistan and Pakistan. And you need to understand, at the time, there was nothing else like this in the world. While there are other terrorist groups, none of them had the open support of a government in the way that Al Qaeda enjoyed the Taliban support in Afghanistan. Al Qaeda operated pretty openly. They trained tens of thousands of fighters. They recruited, they raised money, they planned many attacks. 9/11 wasn't their first one. They were responsible for the attack on the USS Cole in 2000 and a few other terrorist attacks as well. So there was nothing like this in the world. We had to go and dismantle this terrorist playground that existed in Afghanistan, and we had to prevent it from reestablishing itself as a terrorist safe haven after we left. That's the really hard part. We can go after Al Qaeda, kill a bunch of bad guys, but if we leave, they come right back. Now, there's no end to the number of jihadists in the world, not until the ideology itself dies someday, we hope. So we had to go into Afghanistan, kill, capture as many of Al Qaeda and Taliban as we could. And then we had to help build something, build some kind of a government and army capable of denying terrorist safe haven after we left. And many people won't believe this, but I want to tell you, we were making progress. We really were making progress. The Afghan people, they liked their new constitution that they wrote and adopted in 2004. There were some problems with their government being corrupt and incompetent, but they liked their new constitution. The Afghan economy had actually grown pretty consistently over 20 years. We had degraded Al Qaeda, that we had not defeated them. The Afghan army, most importantly, was much better than it was in 2001, because in 2001 it did not exist. There was literally no Afghan security force because the Taliban up and left, and the Afghan army were the bad guys. They left. So we had to start from scratch, literally from scratch. There were 0 soldiers on our side from Afghanistan. And there's some reasons why it took such a long time, but we were able to put together a fighting force by about 2010 that fought and held the line against the Taliban for 10 years. So we made progress. We were making uneven, slow, and fitful progress, and it was fragile progress, as we've seen this past week. It was very fragile. We pulled out, it collapsed.
Do you agree with critics who say that the Bush administration took their eye off the ball in getting involved in the Iraq war? And if they had not done that, then there would have been more of the proper focus in Afghanistan to stabilize the country earlier. And as you say, not just, I think people think, oh, it's nation building, but what I'm hearing, it's not so much that, it's sort of avoiding a real hornet's nest developing that would
Yeah.
infect the rest of the world, sort of upsetting the ability of the Taliban and Al Qaeda and other terrorist groups to establish a
Yeah.
stronghold infrastructure, then that could change the world order. But do you agree that if it had just been Afghanistan and not all the blood and treasure in Iraq, we might be in a different posture?
Yes. And I say that with some regret and some sorrow, because I need to admit that in 2003, I narrowly supported the war in Iraq, but I think that it's been very clear in hindsight that that was a mistake. And we can imagine a different world where we didn't choose to fight a second war, where Afghanistan goes very differently. I will highlight, however, a second mistake by the Bush administration, a little bit unrelated to Iraq. The Bush administration did choose to go in Afghanistan with a pretty light footprint. Bush had campaigned against nation building. Donald Rumsfeld was committed to light footprint operations for his own reasons. We tried to outsource a lot of the state building to the United Nations, which didn't work very well. And all of that was true before we invaded Iraq. And I think that that light footprint was also unhelpful. I think considering the level of Afghanistan's need in 2001 and 2, we probably ought to have considered something a bit more substantial to uphold order throughout the countryside, prevent the resurgence of warlordism, which is what did happen, prevent the resurgence of the drug trade, and frankly, prevent the emergence of the Taliban insurgency. The Taliban, they were defeated from 2002 through 2005. The Taliban insurgency that just won this last weekend, they didn't start until 2005, right? Afghanistan was basically not at war for 2002, 3, 4, and most of 2005. Just sporadic violence. We might have been able to prevent the insurgency if we had initially gone in a bit more intensively to provide order and more reconstruction assistance early on. So that's a second mistake I'd highlight in the early years.
So what happened in 2005, and how do you square that with your earlier comment that the Afghan people actually liked their new constitution and the reconstituted government that wasn't controlled by the Taliban?
Well, by 2005, the Taliban had taken safe haven in Pakistan. They were starting to get rich off the drug trade. They were able to put themselves back together. They had breathing room. And by 2005, I think Afghans were growing a little bit impatient with the corruption and the incompetence of their government. They liked the constitution, but the actual government was pretty corrupt and incompetent. And they did not have any semblance of law and order in the provinces because there was no peacekeeping force out there. I think people may believe mistakenly that the United States or maybe the United Nations went into Afghanistan with main force and had a peacekeeping force to uphold order throughout Afghanistan. That we were doing nation building on a massive scale. Okay, none of that happened. We didn't do any of that stuff. There was no peacekeeping outside of Kabul until 2006 because Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld wanted to keep international military forces out of the way so that we could just go on killing terrorists. He wanted a free fire zone. Right. So he kept the peacekeepers out of the provinces for the most part for 5 years. And so the Afghan people did not have any law and order. There was just pure warlordism in the provinces and the drug trade. And so when the Taliban walked back in to Kandahar in 2005, it was very easy for them to announce their presence. And they did so in a very dramatic way. There was a cleric in Kandahar who had organized a council of religious scholars from across Afghanistan to denounce the Taliban and support the Karzai government. So the Taliban assassinated that cleric, and then they suicide bombed his funeral in mid 2005. And that was the dramatic announcement that the Taliban were back. And from that point forward, you saw the escalation of violence month by month, year by year, until it culminated this last weekend.
Okay, so a couple pieces of the puzzle that I wanted to just add back in there before we move on to more modern times. What is throughout this? What was the role in the development of ISIS, number one, Russia, number two, and the rest of the kind of ally community, number three, in terms of maintaining, on the third part, maintaining an infrastructure? Because what I'm hearing you saying is we came in for good reasons, then we were about killing terrorists, not peacekeeping, not building the infrastructure. So where were our allies, other people, or other governments across the globe in that? So those three extra players on the stage here.
So I'll kind of carry the story forward here. It was around 2000, late 2006 and early 2007 that the international community recognized that Afghanistan was kind of going south. Things were looking pretty bad, and decided that we needed to do something a bit different. And so most of the European countries and the United States really tried to step up their game and spend a bit more money on reconstruction assistance. By this time, NATO had taken over the UN mandated force called the International Security Assistance Force. And so NATO was on the ground, I think from 2003 forward, but they expanded their presence after 2006, as did the United States. So by 2007, 8, and into 9, you start to see a greater international presence and the beginnings of a counterinsurgency campaign. again, led by the US, but in partnership with NATO allies and the Afghan government. President Obama comes into office, and many people have forgotten, he promised to win the war on the campaign trail. There's this revisionist history going around that Obama promised to get out of the war. That's not true. He promised to get out of the war in Iraq, but he promised to win the war in Afghanistan. And in his first year in office, he significantly escalated the war by sending a lot more troops, which was, I think, the right move. And he promised a civilian surge and didn't deliver on it. And so we had a situation where there's a lot of international military forces. We started training a lot of Afghan security forces. We continued to have a weak, incompetent Afghan government. And the war escalates in intensity. And it really shocks the Obama administration with how hard, difficult, and costly this is going to be. And so by the end of 2009, Obama re-examines his own strategy again, and that's when he announces his withdrawal deadlines, which I think is his administration's catastrophic mistake. President Obama says, we're going to send more troops, but we're also going to pull them out in 18 months. And throughout his presidency, every single time he talked about Afghanistan, he talked about withdrawing from Afghanistan. He did a very poor job of explaining what the war was for, what it was about. He never tried to rally public opinion for it. He tried to essentially run away from the war. And he promised at one point in 2014, promised to withdraw completely. He said, we're getting out by the end of 2016. Former members of his own administration signed an open letter saying that's a bad idea. And by the end of 2015, you asked about ISIS. By the end of 2015, ISIS had finally emerged from the ashes of the war in Iraq. ISIS had been on the rampage across Iraq, conquering territory, defeating the Iraqi army. And we were forced to re-intervene in Iraq to fight against ISIS, right? We went to war, we pulled out in 2011, we go back in 2014. It's just a mess, it's a debacle, right? And so the lesson for Afghanistan seems to be pretty obvious. Don't withdraw, because if we withdraw, it's going to turn into a terrorist playground and things like ISIS may emerge. And so Obama backtracks. To his credit, I think this was the right decision, and he does not complete the withdrawal by the end of 2016. He says, you know what? I'm going to leave the troops there, and I'm going to let the next administration deal with this. They will make the decision whether to stay or go.
So when you were there, excuse my dog. You were there for the transition between President Bush and President Obama. Was your advice consistent to both presidents? That is, President Bush, you need to do more. President Obama, you're right to do more.
I think the answer is yes. Of course, evaluating, I'm grading my own report card here. So yes, I was wise and consistent and brilliant, right? I mean, I don't know. We'll have to wait for the historians to go and look up, the memos I wrote and see how good they were or how consistent. I don't want to exaggerate my role either. I was a staffer in the White House. Most decisions were made well above my pay grade. But yes, I argued pretty consistently that we needed to fully resource a counterinsurgency strategy and devote more to reconstruction and sort of political stabilization. I thought that was kind of the key missing ingredient. And yes, that was my advice to both administrations. I left right before President Obama made the decision to adopt the withdrawal deadline, but I would have argued very strongly against that. I think that was a terrible idea.
So you've said publicly and written publicly and been quoted extensively that the war, in your view, in Afghanistan was winnable. And what would winning have looked like? I think the counter argument is, well, if you always have to have troops there, if you always have to prop up the Afghan people, then that's not ever winning a war. And I think President Biden's position has been, listen, it's either the Afghans suffer or American soldiers suffer. I'm not willing to send, of course, I'm paraphrasing, send more Americans over there, particularly as it seems like what we're hearing from this White House is that while those people we did train caved. I mean, in a press conference today, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs Mark Milley, as well as Secretary of State Austin, both said, "Whoa, we didn't expect 11 days the country to fall to the Taliban." That almost saying, "Wow, the Afghans don't really want their own government. We were so surprised." I wonder what your reaction is to that.
Yeah. So there's a couple different questions sort of implied in there. One is kind of historically, what could we have done otherwise? And Bush could have done a heavier footprint. He could have not invaded Iraq. Obama could have not adopted a withdrawal timetable. You asked me, was the war ever winnable? I think Obama actually came pretty close to winning it in about 2012 or so, because his military surge was working, and the Taliban were actually putting out some feelers for serious negotiations around 2011, 12, and 13, because the military pressure, I think, was working. But then they understood we're withdrawing because Obama told them that we're withdrawing, and so they knew they could just wait us out, and that essentially killed the negotiations in that time frame. So those are things that could have gone differently historically. Now the other question is, did by the time Biden inherited the war, was it inevitable? And my answer here is again, no, it was not inevitable. Biden saying it's inevitable is transparently his effort to avoid responsibility for his own decisions. By the time we get to 2021, the war in Afghanistan was nearly not an American war at all anymore. We had gone down to 2,500 troops. And for the previous 7 years, the United States was playing a supporting role and had lost almost no troops in combat. I think the number is 66 soldiers over 7 years. I don't want to minimize the individual losses, but that's not a war. That's not at the scale of a war for the United States. We had achieved something that was sustainable. And because it was sustainable, President Biden did not have to pull the plug on it. Some of the president's advisors are now saying that the violence was low because of the peace deal that Trump signed. Again, that's false. Our presence and our losses were very low, dating all the way back to 2014 at least. So we had, again, achieved some sort of sustainable situation. I want to be clear. I don't think that that situation was ideal. It was not optimal. I have plenty of criticisms about that strategy, but it was a lot better than what we just saw this last weekend. So President Biden certainly could have kept doing that strategy with a very minimal American presence, providing training, advise, and assist the Afghan army and air cover for their army that kept our troops mostly out of harm's way. Finally, you brought up the point. The Afghan army didn't seem to fight this past week. Doesn't that prove they never would? I want to emphasize that the Afghan army stood and fought for 10 years, and they lost 55,000 troops fighting against the Taliban, against our common enemies. So for the President of the United States to say that they didn't fight is just it's a bald-faced lie, and it's an insult that dishonors their sacrifice to their country. Why did they choose not to fight in the final weeks? It's because President Biden told them that we're leaving, and he pulled their support. The Afghan soldiers, again, the Afghan army was gradually getting better, but we always said they're not quite ready yet. And that was a true statement, obviously. President Biden pulled the plug when he knew that the Afghan army wasn't ready yet. So what did he think was going to happen? For him to claim that this was an intelligence failure or that he was taken by surprise is it's shocking to me that he or his advisors could say such a thing. They knew the Afghan army wasn't ready yet, and they pulled the plug anyway. When the Afghan soldier on the field knows that the American that he's been fighting with for a decade is leaving, and the air cover that he depends upon is leaving, I don't blame that Afghan soldier for saying, I'm not going to commit suicide. I'm going to go home and be with my family. And maybe the Taliban won't execute me on the way out. That's what the Afghan soldiers said. That's why they chose not to fight in the past week. But they stood and fought for 10 years as long as we were with them.
Explain, you mentioned the word air cover, the term air cover. Explain what you mean by that in terms of protection, backup of Americans for Afghan soldiers. I mean, most Americans many Americans couldn't probably point to Afghanistan on a map, let alone be there on the ground and understand what it's like for these people. Take us to inside what it's like for one of these Afghan soldiers and what happened when you say that Biden pulled the plug. How did their day-to-day change?
So the war in Afghanistan, since about 2014, was carried on by Afghan troops on the ground and the U.S. Air Force. And the connective tissue was a very small number of American ground forces that embedded themselves with the Afghan army to provide the communications to the US Air Force. So our air power plus their ground troops kept the Taliban at bay. That's a very powerful and effective way to fight a force like the Taliban, because the Taliban have no air force. We had complete air superiority, and that gives the Afghan soldiers confidence that we've got their backs. We can drop bombs on the enemy position. We can call in close air support. And then let's also talk about the helicopters. That's medevac. That's logistics. If the Afghan soldiers are wounded on the field, it was often an American helicopter that flew in to get them out of there and get them to an American doctor to patch them up. Those are the sorts of, for us, low cost and also low risk ways of assisting the Afghans that did a tremendous amount to give them confidence and courage and a belief that they could actually win individual battles against the Taliban. That's why they stood and fought for 10 years. Those are the things we just took away in the last few months. And we took that away knowing that the Afghans were not yet ready to replace those resources with their own.
When did that start? When you say take away, when did Biden start taking away the sort of air support backup, which I can understand? I mean, if you think of yourself walking out of your house and you're a target, and you know the Americans are sort of looming around in the sky, and if you get injured, they're going to medevac you and take care of you. That's a very different situation than walking out and fending for yourself.
My understanding is that it really began to draw down this April. President Biden made his decision and announced it in April. And again, my understanding is that's when the sort of final American evacuation began. And the military's mission abruptly changed. Up until April, the military was still doing the embedded advise, train, and assist and the air support. After April, the US military's mission was get out. And it actually does take weeks and months to fully pull out a couple thousand troops with all the material and things like that. But they were virtually gone by last week or the week before, and that's why what happened. I do want to make sure to say, and not leave this part out of the story, that President Trump was the one who signed the peace deal with the Taliban, which President Biden has simply implemented. I'm giving Biden a lot of criticism here, as everybody has, and he deserves it for his just unbelievably incompetent execution of this decision. The decision itself was bad. The execution was bad. But I want to give criticism where it's due to the Trump administration for signing the peace deal in the first place. It was a bad deal, and it obligated the United States to withdraw without putting almost any real concessions or demands on the Taliban in return. And so that's what President Biden sort of inherited when he took office. It's baffling to me that he accepted it. President Biden repudiated almost all of Trump's policies in every other way. Why keep this one? It's a mystery. But he did decide to honor the agreement after a couple of months delay, and that was a bad choice.
So yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. Backing up, so Donald Trump signed an agreement with the Taliban saying the Americans would pull out, and has been criticized because the Afghan government, the other sort of groups in Afghanistan that were trying to establish their own government, weren't at the table when Donald Trump did that. And I've heard part of the argument for why President Biden adhered to that agreement was, well, if we didn't, then, I mean, in exchange purportedly for this deal, what President Trump got on behalf of the United States is an agreement not to kill more American soldiers. It sounds like, in talking to you, there wasn't really a big problem with American soldiers being executed in Afghanistan. But the argument I've heard is that, well, if Joe Biden didn't stick with Donald Trump's deal, then all of a sudden there would be an assault on American soldiers by the Taliban. So he needed to adhere to it in order to protect American soldiers.
That's the claim coming out of the administration. They've said that if he repudiated the deal, the Taliban would attack American soldiers and we'd have, lots and lots of American KIA. But again, I just want to emphasize Americans were simply not being killed by the Taliban in large numbers for the last 7 years. The American soldiers were largely out of harm's way. They were not engaged in direct ground combat against the Taliban in large numbers, not since 2014 and even a few years before that. So it's disingenuous and wrong for the Biden administration to claim that suddenly there'd be, scores or hundreds of American body bags coming home if he repudiated the deal. That's just not true.
So let's accept, for the sake of argument, the decision to withdraw on the rationale that, well, it was a three president handing off the baton, right? You've got Obama initially deciding, Trump following up on that, bipartisan in a way, and then we have Joe Biden agreeing to that. I want to talk about the execution. So if we were to agree, okay, we're going to pull out, even though it's going to leave a vacuum for the Taliban to come in, what's happening with the execution that, in your experience, particularly in the military and of course the CIA, that it was avoidable? I mean, I remember the chaos in Iraq,
Yeah.
and the Bush administration was hammered for that withdrawal that then
Yeah.
just created massive chaos and the rise of ISIS and things. What are you seeing that, even if you were to take for the sake of argument that, okay, we're going to pull out, what's being done wrong
Yeah.
in terms of the execution of the rollout? Of course, we're seeing people hanging from planes, jumping from planes, almost an irony given 9/11, people jumping out of the windows. It's sort of this bizarre turn of fate. But the response I'm hearing through the television from these press briefings is, well, there's always going to be chaos. NSA, National Security Director Jake Sullivan said yesterday, well, it was inevitable. National Security Advisor, excuse me, it was inevitable to have chaos. So we just have some flavor of chaos. That's what happens when you pull out of countries like this.
So it's funny you mentioned the withdrawal from Iraq, because none of this happened in Iraq. I'm not a fan of the pullout in Iraq at all. And yes, there were some obviously bad consequences that came from that, but we didn't have people clinging to airplanes on the way out of Baghdad. So there were some clear failures in execution here that just made a bad situation even worse. To my mind, and I'm speaking a little bit outside of my own expertise here, but it seems to me that the administration never had a sense of urgency in planning the withdrawal, particularly the processing of special immigration visa applicants. And I've heard various numbers. Some say 12,000, some say 88,000. I don't know what the number is, but there's clearly tens of thousands of Afghans who worked with the coalition, whom we have promised to resettle. And the administration had no urgency in resolving these cases and getting them out of the country. I've read that it has been taking 800 days to process an SIV application, which is just shockingly bureaucratic. And if the administration was serious and urgent about withdrawing responsibly, they should have tackled that bureaucracy, cut that red tape, expedited the process, increased the throughput before announcing our withdrawal. To wait, you get these people out of the country before April. You get them out of the country before you make the announcement. That's what you do, so that you're not rushing to the exit and causing panic. You also, by the way, get the American citizens out of country. My understanding is there's, I think, upwards of 10,000 American citizens that are essentially stuck, they're trapped right now. And the United States is not doing anything about it. They're not even sending people outside of the airport to collect our citizens. They're saying, hey, look, if you get to the airport, we'll get you out. Good luck. But you get to the airport on your own. Again, to me, that's a shocking dereliction of duty. The United States doesn't do that, right? We're supposed to go get our people and protect them. And again, they should have had this plan in place before April, before Biden made the announcement. For him to make that announcement without plans in place is irresponsible, and it's a dereliction of duty.
So just to play devil's advocate, Jake Sullivan was asked that yesterday about American citizens, and the answer was, well, we warned them and we said we would pay for them to come out, and a lot of people just decided to stay in country. Number two, today in the presser with Milley and Austin, they were asked about, okay, how are you going to actually get people from the countryside to the airports now that the airports are actually functioning? And the answer was, well, we're just having a hard time processing people at the airport. And I'm paraphrasing, we have no capability to actually go comb and bring people to the airport. We are working with the Taliban. So it's almost relying on the good faith of the Taliban to turn these people over. Reaction to those responses?
No, I think you're right. That's where we are, which is, again, why I say this is such a shocking display of irresponsibility by the administration. How do I put this? The fact that we didn't have the capabilities on the ground already to handle this kind of withdrawal or evacuation or refugee resettlement before the president made his announcement, that tells you all you need to know about how little the administration cared. I think that they have exuded from the beginning, since January, they have exuded a lack of interest, an annoyance, a flippancy about Afghanistan, about all the problems. It's a messy situation. We don't want to deal with it. We're shutting it down. We're getting out. And they did not have urgency. They didn't do the planning. They didn't do their homework. And now there's tens of thousands of people stuck, and we're relying on the good graces of the Taliban to not have a massacre on our hands.
So it seems like you and maybe some of your former colleagues are, emotionally pretty upset and invested in this. Is that fair to say? And does that come from knowing people in Afghanistan and having participated in the 20 years of work there?
Yes, and I am a little emotional about this. I'm sorry if it's a little much.
No, no, I
um,
don't mean that as I don't mean that as a
yeah,
critique. I think I ask it because I think Americans that aren't dialed into this
yeah,
need to understand it. I actually think it's a good thing,
yeah,
frankly, for people to have a reason to care and not say, well, that's Afghanistan,
yeah.
that's their problem. Why is it my problem?
Well, let me share a little bit of what it's felt like as a veteran this week, um, and then share, yeah, just a few thoughts here. Watching this unfold feels like an abandonment of our allies. And I'm talking about the Afghans, right? We served shoulder to shoulder with the Afghans, and we've abandoned them. It feels like a betrayal of everything that we fought and sacrificed for. When a soldier goes to war for the country and the commander in chief, the commander in chief says you're going to war for XYZ, and we say yes, sir, we're going to go do it, and it feels like we've just betrayed all of that, right? Lincoln talked about honoring the purpose for which people made the sacrifice. I don't feel honored here, and it also feels like a cheapening, a trivialization of everything of all our efforts, of the years of our lives we gave to this, right? I think I'm not just speaking for myself here. I've talked with many other veterans this week, and look, we're going through a hard time. If your listeners, your viewers know veterans, please reach out to them. There's a lot of mixed emotions here. Just say, hey, look, I'm thinking about you. I'm praying for you. If you need somebody to talk to, I'm here, because it's a bit of a rough time for us. And again, it's much harder for the people who are living under it in Afghanistan today. But yeah, it's been rough for me, and it's rough for veterans right now. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, unless you had another thought, I was going to shift to the question of being rough for the people over there.
Yeah, that's fine.
And if you could explain, what is Sharia law? What is that? And why is it that one thing we are hearing, I can't speak for Fox News, but I think on, the sort of the CNN, MSNBC, BBC, kind of other mainstream outlets, we are hearing that, wow, this is a really doomsday proposition for women and girls in Afghanistan.
Yeah. Sharia law is essentially Islamic jurisprudence. Uh, it's vaguely analogous to canon law in the Catholic Church, right? It's a series of kind of rules and rule making or decision making rules for Islamic scholars when they confront questions of theology and ethics and morality. Sharia law, in every school of thought, there's multiple different sort of traditions and schools, what we might call denominations. There's multiple schools of thought within Islamic jurisprudence, but they all are pretty critical of what we would call women's rights, right? Sharia law does not treat women as co-equal human beings with men. Sharia law puts men as the head of not just the household, but essentially of everything. And there's various interpretations of this, right? In some Islamic countries, women aren't treated like garbage, but under the Taliban in the 90s, they were, right? Women were not allowed to work. Women were not allowed to go to school. Women were compelled, when they went out of doors, to wear the burqa, which is even more than a headscarf. It is a full body, full face covering. And they were required to go out accompanied by a male guardian or chaperone. So women were simply not treated as humans, as people. They were not co-equal citizens. They were subjects. The Taliban has made a couple statements promising to and I want to get the phrasing right, they say, we will respect women's rights within the bounds of Islamic law. That tells you all you need to know, because within the bounds of Islamic law means there will be no women's rights. So the Taliban, they know how to spin the international media. They know their propaganda pretty well, and they know how to say things that the international media wants to hear, but don't believe any of it. Give it about 6 months after the spotlight has moved on, and you'll see the Taliban's full measure of barbarism again.
And what's the consequence for Paul for not complying if you're a woman in Afghanistan for not complying with these requirements?
In the 1990s, the consequence was often to be stoned to death, literally stoned to death, or it depends upon the offense, right? They could be stoned, they could lose a hand. I don't want to get too graphic, but use your imagination here. There's a lot of other ways that they could exact reprisals on women who flouted the Taliban law.
So it sounds like it's fair to say that half the population is really not only is the investment of American soldiers being kind of discarded, but also the women in the country of Afghanistan and girls and children
Yeah.
are now facing an uncertain future.
And President, and President Biden has made clear that he just doesn't think that's America's interest, right?
Exactly.
We went to war to kill terrorists. Congratulations, we killed a lot of them. We're going to go home. I think that's a pretty shallow understanding of what the war was about, because again, as I said, it's not simply about killing terrorists. It's about permanently denying safe haven by building something that can deny safe haven when we leave, which we plainly failed to do. And as long as we're talking about building a government capable of denying safe haven, we ought to advocate for a vision of the world that we think is right and just, which includes women's rights and religious freedom. And the Afghans actually agreed. Again, their constitution is very popular. The Afghan people really liked the constitution that they had for about 20 years. There's widespread support for their constitution, which enshrined certain principles of women's rights and even religious freedom. So this is not imperialism. We're not foisting our way of life on somebody else. They voted for it. They liked it. And now we've abandoned them. And that constitution is in the dustbin of history. And the Afghan women, Afghan religious minorities, a new and very fragile Afghan Christian community, all of them are under threat of tyranny and possibly execution.
How does Afghanistan play into our global posture and our national security on a larger scale? And I don't have obviously even a fraction of your deep expertise, but again, I want to mention Russia because under the last president of the United States, there was quite a cozy relationship between Vladimir Putin and America. And some of us, I mean, my background is in constitutional separation of powers theory, and many of us are quite worried about America slipping into a one-party, single-party totalitarian state, which in no short order has to do in part with the last president's abandonment of democratic values and cozying up with dictators, frankly. So I wonder if there's a concern there as well with Afghanistan falling to the Taliban. And I know you also have obviously deep expertise in Pakistan, and that is also a harbor for terrorists.
That's a great question. And I actually just wrote an article today. I think it may be going up on the Dispatch perhaps tomorrow, kind of on this subject. I think it's okay for us to recognize that the fall of Kabul is not the most important geopolitical event of the 21st century. Afghanistan is a small and poor country, and we're not at immediate risk of being overrun by terrorists tomorrow. But it doesn't have to be the most important thing for us to recognize that it's one more step on a long road that we've been traveling for 30 years now, the road of the descent of the free world, the rise of authoritarianism, and the devolution of world order into a pretty nasty zero-sum fight for power, prestige, and wealth among the nations of the world, right? You have to understand that for 80 years, the United States spearheaded, championed, along with our allies, mostly in Europe, but also in East Asia, a different kind of world. And we were amazingly successful at building a different kind of world among the free nations of the earth. Some people, I think most people in our generations take this for granted because we've never known anything else. We've never known anything else than a world in which we can travel to Europe. We can travel almost anywhere in the world. We can do business. We can do cultural exchange. We can do scientific research and innovation cooperatively across the globe. That's a world that we take for granted. That world has been very slowly crumbling for about 30 years because the non-democratic powers of the world have been gaining strength and we have been losing strength. I don't want to be chicken little here. I'm not saying like World War III is coming tomorrow. I am saying that the world order we are accustomed to has been crumbling at the edges year after year, very slowly. Okay, so that's the story in which Kabul fell to the Taliban. It is one more erosion. It's one more chink in the armor of the free world. We tried very hard to bring this poor country into the sort of the family of free nations, and we failed, and the bad guys won. That allows the forces of authoritarianism, tyranny, and terror one more foothold. It expanded their power and their influence. There is a global contest between freedom and authoritarianism in the world today, and we just lost one battle. Not the most important battle, perhaps, but we lost one, and everybody should know that that's what it is. And someday, look, the straw that breaks the camel's back, we don't know which straw it's going to be. And no straw takes responsibility for breaking the camel's back. But when the camel's lying on the ground and its back is broken, we know that every single straw played its part. Someday, the fall of Kabul will have played its part in some, I fear, looming catastrophe.
When you say looming catastrophe, I tend to be the chicken little person too when I explain to people, because I also have a expertise in voting and election law, how we are potentially an election away from the end of democracy if we have single party rule, if both houses of Congress and the midterms go to what's now the Republican Party, not the traditional Republican Party. Is there a way, in your view, as a professor and an educator, as well as this expertise, to explain to young people who watch the show, people in their early 20s or late teens, what's at stake here for them? And I say, you talk about the camel on the ground. To me, the camel in part is what you describe, rights, and rights are not God-given, or we're not entitled to them. And you have expertise. You've seen what it's like to live in other parts of the world where there are, or be in the other parts of the world, know people in other parts of the world where people don't have those rights. How would you thread that needle, just as a last question, between, okay, the straws that are burdening the camel of freedom and liberty across the globe? And I've had a China expert on the show who made your very argument. Listen, China wants world domination.
Yep.
That's their end game.
Yep.
And okay, well, I'm just going to start school next week. You and I are both professors. I got to get my third COVID shot. I've got kids. We both have kids. Not my problem. What's the thread between this and what's at stake for us in our individual lives? It's making something concrete that feels very abstract and just not my problem.
So for students out there, most of them, I think many of them will contemplate a study abroad program. We might live in a world where there's no study abroad, right? Where international travel and exchange is extremely difficult or costly or very narrowly limited to a couple of countries. Right now, Americans can't go to Iran or Cuba or North Korea, 3 countries or thereabouts, right? It might be a lot more than that within our lifetimes, because the world might constrict and become less free. Okay, that's one small example of how it would affect young people's lives. The world economy, we are fabulously rich. Humanity is fabulously rich compared to any other prior point in human history, in part because we now have a global division of labor. I understand there's some problems with with how these riches are allocated. Totally get that. But a more constricted world means a poorer world. It will be harder to get jobs. It'll be harder to earn a decent wage. It'll be harder to buy stuff. Stuff will get more expensive with less international trade. The iPhone is a miracle of globalization. It was invented by an American mind, but it's largely manufactured elsewhere. That's another small example of how our lives will change. Stuff gets more expensive. I think the pace of scientific research and discovery will slow down. It'll be harder to invent things when the world is more constricted, when there's less free movement of people, ideas, and goods. Um, if anybody out there is, yeah, those are a couple of examples I think that I can think of how it really kind of comes down to the human level. I think at the end of the day, we have to ask ourselves what kind of world we want to live in. Do we want to live in a world where, as you said, rights, where the ideas of freedom and equality predominate throughout the world? Or do we want to live in a world where the ideas of freedom and equality are a minority position that we have to fight hard to preserve? And the alternate set of ideas is essentially Chinese world leadership and perhaps autocracy at home. And if you want to push back on that, go to your local city council meeting, get involved, vote in elections, run for office, get informed, organize your neighborhood. Do something to be publicly involved, because that is the lifeblood of the free society that we want to hold dear, that I think many of us have taken for granted.
Well, I couldn't have said it better. Paul Miller, thank you so much for being on Simple Politics. I learned a lot, and I know this is a bit cliche, but thank you for your years and years of service and dedication, not only to American interests, but to this broader question or value of equality and fairness and justice across the globe.
Thank you. I appreciate it.